Ahoy! I'm back, and it is week 2 of the Teach Us Dr. Hirsch reading series, lecture series, reading series, one of those two. And this week we're actually going to be talking about really my favorite topic, probably in this general lecture series, research methods in statistics. Although my degree is technically in social psychology, overall I am by and large more of what we would call a quantitative psychologist, and that is to say I am much closer to being a statistician than I am to still being a researcher. So I'm very passionate about research methods. I'm gonna get a little bit shady, a lot of bit shady in this chapter because it turns out that actually a lot of people that do psychological research are not good statisticians and are not good methodologists. And there is a long and storied history of people doing terrible things. So we're gonna talk about some of that. And I'm going to give you some super, super secret statistical knowledge that your whatever intro psych professor that you're learning from in the meat space would not teach you. So I'm going to give you, we're going to leapfrog the boring stuff. I'm going to give you some actual cool stuff you probably wouldn't learn until grad school. But I think we should teach to undergrads because it is very important for being able to interpret research. Let's get started. Let me get a sip of this coffee. Actually, let me get a coffee. I think I need one right now. Do 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 do. Aha. Oh, that's much too large. That's better. Okay, I can live with that. Like I was saying before I got started, it's real lecture hours over here because I am very tired, a little bit hungover. But you know what? It takes me back to my golden years. All right, here we go. Here we go. Here we go. So, I like to start off all of these with a little bit of a roadmap. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of good methods. We're going to talk about different types of study designs. We're going to talk about some ethical research issues in research. And then we're going to talk about statistics and what you can do to apply this stuff right now to evaluate research that you come across in the wild. So, maybe you see a news article, maybe you see a tweet somewhere, maybe you see or somebody tells you that they heard this thing on the internet. Well, at the end of this, about what, hour and a half to 2 hours, you're going to have the tools to be able to evaluate that and be able to say yes, no, or maybe that sounds like on face bullshit. So let's get started. Why does this matter? This is always, I think, a great way to start anything. Like, why should you care? What is the importance of understanding good research design? Well, let's dial back a little ways, but unfortunately not that far of a ways. Back to the 1990s when I was a little baby. I'm an '89 baby, so this was in my infancy, but still within my lifetime. So there was a period where there was a very vogue therapy called facilitated communication, which was used to help children with severe autism communicate. The general idea is that you had a trained, quote unquote, trained facilitator who would with these children that had severe autism and typically were nonverbal, would sort of hold their hand or hold their wrist and facilitate or help them in using a keyboard to communicate. So the idea was that they would hold the child's wrist in a neutral position and then would use the person, presumably the child, would select a key and then the person would help pull their hand back. So the idea was that maybe there was at the time, there was a assumption that some of the issues with nonverbal autistic children might be motor impairments more so than linguistic or cognitive impairments. And so that facilitated communication emerged as a form of therapy or a novel therapy to try to get around and allow these children to communicate. And it was remarkably successful, at least at first. And so you started getting these children that previously were completely nonverbal telling their parents, "Mommy, I want you to know that I love you, even though I can't speak." And even one child said that they had read an article and asked their mother to change their medication. So on face, this seemed miraculous, right? And some of these communications contained very serious allegations. In the case in 1991, in the case of Mark Storch, he was accused of 200 counts of rape, which was then confirmed, quote unquote confirmed, by a second facilitator, which caused him to lose custody of his children. And in 2007, Julian Wendrow was, based on the accusations that emerged through facilitated communication, placed in solitary confinement for 80 days. And in both cases, both men were eventually exonerated because there was no other evidence in these cases outside of what was obtained through facilitated communication. It's fucked up. And to think about this, 1990s, that feels like a very long way away, right? That's over 30 years. But 2007, that's not only within my lifetime. I mean, I was in high school at that point. Like, this was in use and was considered admissible in court, and people's lives were ruined based on facilitated communication, which was at the time considered to be a highly scientific means of treating or assisting children with severe autistic impairments. So, what are some ways that maybe we could test whether or not facilitated communication works? This is where we get into the true wonders of research design. Because at the time, remember, back in the 1990s, this was considered highly scientific and highly sound. So one way that researchers decided to test this was through the use of a blind study. Yeah, so Rowan brings up that it feels like those dogs and cats who can speak by pressing buttons, but except that it's the owner is pushing the pet's paw on the button. Kind of. And it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, they're communicating. But remember Clever Hans from last week? Where it seems like they're communicating, but actually maybe the child is picking up on signals from another person? Much like Clever Hans, or like in some of these cases where it seems like pets can communicate, it's actually they're responding to the desire or the or the expectancy of the person who is ostensibly supposed to be impartial, but they're definitely not. So one of the ways that people decided to deal with this, and yeah, Great Ape language research is actually a whole thing as well that's very similar to this. So one of the ways that people decided to look at this and to test facilitated communication in the lab is by showing the child and the facilitator different pictures, but not telling them. And so the facilitator, it's like feels like they are facilitating the child, and if they are really just being impartial and just helping the child type, well, then we should get an answer. In this case, they should be typing cat. And that doesn't happen. Time and time again, what it seems like is that generally all we saw in the research results in these kinds of studies, it really just depended on what the facilitator saw. And over the course of dozens of studies, that's what robustly came out, that this had nothing to do with what the child saw. And yet, some people still use facilitated communication. Dozens of studies later, it's like about as robust as of a refutal as anything can have. And there are parents that still swear by this. It's hard to judge people, especially in highly emotional situations, but from the perspective of research, I do think that this is a really good example of why research design is so important, because if we get stuck in these trappings of naive realism and our own expectancies, it's hard to critically evaluate the things that are happening in the world around us. And so things like facilitated communication are going to gain traction, and as we saw, can sometimes have very profound effects. Back in grad school, the head of our department had a twin brother who became a medical doctor. So he used to tell us that when he would talk with his doctor brother, like medical doctor brother, they would compare how bad it is when people get things wrong. And one of the takeaways that the head of our department came away with was that, when we really heck up is psychologists, especially research psychologists in the area that we were in, nobody dies. And, he's right. We very rarely cause mortal harm. But as we're going to talk about in this chapter, that doesn't mean that we don't cause harm. And that doesn't mean that we have an excuse to do sloppy research design, especially when human subjects are concerned. Because even well-educated and intelligent people can be fooled. In fact, robustly, it seems like intelligence, however you measure it, whether it's age, educational attainment, or IQ, we'll talk about IQ later for a long time because I got an axe to grind there. none of these things are correlated with self-serving biases. And so things like when we're talking about naive realism and all that, we still really do need these well-planned designs to be able to get away from those personal and self-serving biases, or else we end up hacking up and can cause real harm. So another case, and I'm gonna throw out a quick content warning here because even I get queasy at this picture. So maybe cover your eyes like you're me at a scary movie. But let's talk about prefrontal lobotomies. This is, again, another very egregious example of the importance of good research design. All right. So a prefrontal lobotomy, just to give you kind of the crash course here and what this is and why people did it. This, once again, was very much in vogue as a treatment for a huge range of disorders. It was actually very common. The creator of the prefrontal lobotomy actually created a, oh God, what? I can't believe I'm saying this because it's so ridiculous. He made a tour bus at one point called the Lobotomobile and just drove around the country doing like basically like drive up or like monopolies. It's terrible. All right, Rep, take a seat. You don't need to announce yourself to the class, but I'm glad you're here. Yeah, so it was a tour bus to do prefrontal lobotomies because it was considered to be not even just a treatment, but just a thing you could do to improve your life. Sounds great, right? Just roll up to the Lobomobile, the Oscar Mayer Wiener car of lobotomies. Get yourself lobotomized. It's no big deal, right? Turns out it was a big deal. And the creator actually won a Nobel Prize in 1949 for this treatment. It blows my mind to always do these sections about malpractice, especially in this area, like the 1950s to 1960s, 40s to 60s. But here's the deal. The data they were getting was based on the subjective assessments of the professionals. So the doctor gives you a lobotomy and then says, they seemed fine afterwards. But it didn't hold up in actually controlled clinical trials. And in fact, lobotomies tended to cause enormous behavioral changes, usually didn't treat the symptoms that they were being used for, and actually caused other problems for people. Thank God, in this case, at least, it's no longer used. So, as you can tell, I mean, the idea was you would go up and they would take a rod and they would go through the eye, they would go through the nose, go through the sinuses, any point of entry, and basically sever the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain. It's barbaric. It's egregious. I don't know how to tell people how frightening this is to me. And yet, this was considered to be, again, a wonder technique. They won a Nobel Prize for developing the prefrontal lobotomy. But why? How could they possibly think it worked? Well, confirmation biases. And like I said before, naive realism. You are the doctor. You are emotionally invested. Let's see, electroshock therapy. I'd have to look it up in particular. I want to say that they were used around the same time in conjunction, and often like sometimes for the same things. But that's off the top of my head. I'm not an expert in the history of, I guess it would be psychiatric medicine. So, but going back to the point of departure there, you are a clinician. You are giving people a treatment. You have a motivation to believe that treatment is effective, especially if you're winning awards and grants and your career depends on it. So, in both the case of the prefrontal lobotomy and facilitated communication, these things lasted well after the point where it seems like it was very clear they were not actually useful, and actually it was more clear they were causing harm. So, what does a good research look like, or what does a good research design look like? It depends. And there are 4 broad categories that I want to talk about. And those are going to be naturalistic observation, case studies, correlational designs, and experimental designs. I'm dual, you can't see it, but because my arms don't move, but I'm dual wielding. I got a LaCroix in one hand and my coffee in the other, and I'm just like going back and forth and going back and forth and going back and forth. That kind of morning. All right. So before we talk about research design, I want to talk about validity and reliability. So there are 2 kinds of things that come down to that we look at when we think about validity, and that is external validity, which is, does this thing that I am observing generalize to how people behave in the real world? So if I do something in a lab in a highly fictionalized scenario, even if I ultimately get the behavior that I was looking for, it doesn't really matter if people don't behave like that out in the real world. So for example, I might, what's a way to make this VTuber? Trying to think of something with Kusa. So if you go on and people behave a certain way on stream, so let's say I develop an experiment that I want to do with no ethical approval, where I tell a joke and people start talking about grass in my chat. Well, that's probably not something they're doing in the real world in their daily lives, I would hope. I would hope that people, you don't listen to hear something funny or hear a joke and go, haha, big Kusa, large grass, actually. So people's behavior, we would say, in stream chats around VTubers does not necessarily generalize to their day-to-day behavior, hopefully. And there's also internal validity. And now this is a really important one, and we're going to be thinking about this because only one of the designs that we're going to talk about really can establish internal validity. And that is to say, are we actually measuring the thing that we say we are? So in this case, what you might say is, let's go over some illusionary causations. So we talked last week about how there is a correlation between the number of Nicolas Cage films that are released within a given year and the number of shark attacks. But can we really say that Nicolas Cage is causing shark attacks? Should we fear him? Is Nicolas Cage a greater threat to the natural order than we previously thought? Well, we can't really make that causal claim based on the evidence that we have. Now, if we were to manipulate the number of Nicolas Cage films within a given year, then we could actually start to look at and start to establish internal validity. So the real question there is to say, when we're looking at a relationship, can we really say that we're measuring what we say we are? Oops. Everyone, wish your professor congratulations. This is the first time I've broken animation so far. I got through a whole lecture before I screwed up animations. I'm very good at this, but boop, boop, there we go. So what is naturalistic? What is a naturalistic observation? This is sort of the least scientific approach to collecting data, because it's something that we do all the time. Basically, if you are ever watching other people in the real world, basically doing people watching, we would consider this a form of naturalistic observation. One example here, because I love using Simpsons references wherever I can, think about Jane Goodall, famous for her work with chimpanzees. By not intervening with the chimpanzees, but just observing them and taking observations of their social structure and the way that their lives work, Jane Goodall was able to obtain a tremendous amount of data that was has become extremely influential in the field of primatology. And there's high external validity in these designs because if the point of external validity is to say, does the data we're collecting generalize to how people behave in the real world? Well, guess what? It is the most real worldist, right? You're literally watching people in the real world and taking notes on it. Now, there are some things to consider here, though. We call them observer or Hawthorne effects, where does the fact that a person is being observed potentially change their behavior? And so you might see that people start to try to hide that they are observing people or doing any number of other metrics to try to minimize what we call observer effects. However, even though these have really high external validity, it's impossible to establish causation. We can't say that X is causing Y, and so we don't consider naturalistic observation, oh hi Hazel, to be highly scientific. Is this why two-way mirrors were invented? It's a very good question. In part, yeah. And so the idea that permeates all of the designs that we're looking at here is that by observing somebody and allowing them to know that you are monitoring their behavior, it is likely that they will change their behavior in ways that They might either they might intuit what you are at the behavior you are looking for. We would call this a demand characteristic. And then they might produce that behavior or act out that behavior because they think it's what you want them to do. Or they might go ahead and do the opposite. And if it's something that might be socially undesirable, specifically not do the thing. And so we developed the old one-way mirrors where to try to minimize these effects, where you could observe someone in a situation without having them be aware that they are being observed. In fact, so back in grad school, the psychology building, they had a very long, let's see, secondary question here before I get to my anecdote. Is the Hawthorne observer effect why so many studies try to obfuscate what the real thing they're studying is? Yep, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but that is exactly true. That is exactly correct. Yeah, it's like someone might actually change their answer. So social influence is a concern. There's also, when we talk about Milgram, we know that authority is a very big concern. And so a lot of studies specifically will try to obscure or have cover stories to hide what they're actually doing. So back in the day, back in my golden age in grad school, when I was actually 24 and not just eternally 24, our department had a strong research tradition in behaviorism and experimental studies. And so all the grad school offices used to be observation rooms. And so actually there was a big whiteboard in my tiny office. And I was wondering for a long time, like, why is there this big whiteboard? And one day I kind of peeked behind it and there was a one-way mirror. So the whole time I've been working in this office and not knowing that I was in an old behavioral observation room where there was a hidden one-way mirror. And of course, the people next to me could look, if I ever were to take down that whiteboard, the people in the office next to me could look into my office and I could not look into theirs. It was very uncomfortable. It was not a great discovery. Also, it'd be fun because we would be going through like the archives in the basement and we'd find old shock generators and stuff. You know, cool stuff. Yeah, so if I didn't have it, yep, someone could be watching me, which was a little bit uncomfortable. But not as uncomfortable as going through your lab space and finding old shock generators. Yeah, they are the scariest looking things, let me tell you. Anyway, so moving on, case studies. What is a case study? So if naturalistic observation is looking at people in a natural environment, case studies are looking at very intently at one person or a group of people for an extended period of time. So why would you do this? Well, in some cases, it turns out that there can be extremely rare occurrences that you either cannot find a sufficient number of people to be able to naturalistically observe, or it's so spectacular. Like we talked about, and we'll talk about in the future when we get to the biology of the brain, we'll talk about Phineas Gage. But so Phineas Gage, cliff notes before we get to him in the lecture, had a railroad spike blown through his head and he didn't die. So his case, he became a case study in how the physical brain interacts with people's behaviors. I mean, after all, he had a railroad tie-in shot through his head. So in those cases where you might only have a handful of instances across the entire world, case studies are a great way to gather data, even if it's just to prove that that thing exists to justify later research. But is there external validity? Not really, because these tend to be very rare, and so it's hard to know whether or not there's really any generalizability at all. Is there internal validity? No, because you can't infer causation. So why would you even do this, right? Well, I want to introduce you to Genie. Genie is a landmark case in the fields of sociology and developmental psychology. Genie was kept in isolation by her abusive parents until the age of 13, and spent almost her entire childhood locked in a bedroom and isolated and abused for over a decade. Now, what does this mean? So if you go back through, if you search Genie, child, or psychology or sociology, what you're going to find is that Genie was referred to consistently in the media as a feral child. With very little social contact, no formal schooling, and coming up to the age of 13, there were many theories, particularly in areas like language development, that you could not test, at least ethically test on a human being. So for example, one of which was the idea of a critical period in language development, where if a person had not mastered a language by basically the onset of puberty, they were not going to master language at all. You could not do this to a person. You could not inflict this kind of neglect on a human being ethically. And so when Genie was discovered, it presented an opportunity for case studies to look at whether or not this extremely rare instance could possibly validate or give some kind of credence or evidence to many of these theories that previously had been untestable. Correlational designs. All right, let me take a quick sippy. That's what it looks like when a VTuber drinks. So what is a correlational design? We talked a little bit about these when we got into last week, but basically a correlational design is measuring two things and then seeing if they are related. So for example, is there a correlation between the game that I play on stream and my overall viewership? Is there a correlation between the number of funny jokes that I tell and the number of subscribers? Is there a correlation between the number of stolen jokes that a person tweets in a week and their following? Turns out there probably is. When it comes to correlations, we tend to measure them what we call a R value, or Pearson's R, or R squared, which ranges from -1 to +1, and can either be positive, negative, or zero. Zeros are less common. Positive correlation means if one value increases, the other is more likely to increase. Negative means that as the one increases, the other is more likely to decrease, and zero means there is no correlation between variables. Statistically, we use tests to try to avoid the idea of an illusory correlation. That is to say, one where it feels like there is an association, but really none exists. Which is similar to what we talked about with patternicity, where our brains are very, very, very good at developing a set of rules or inferring patterns of our environment, even though there are none there. So think for a second about, we talked about the hot hand fallacy, right? People tend to intuitively believe that if they shoot one basket in basketball, they are more likely to make the next shot as well. It's called heating up. In the actual wild world of statistics, that does not exist, but it really feels like it should, and so that continues to exist in people's minds. This is why we do correlational designs, because doing the actual math would show that this doesn't actually exist in the real world, no matter how hard you want it to. And we typically depict these via scatterplots. You've probably seen many of these in your world. Yep, it is, Let me ask the Google real quick. So the question is that the opposite of the gambler's fallacy? Let me ask the Google real quick to make sure that I am thinking about the right gambler's fallacy. Let's see, also known as the Monte Carlo fallacy. Let's see, it is the incorrect belief that if a particular event occurs more frequently than during the past, it is less likely to happen in the future. Basically, yeah. So one of the fun things that we'll talk about with statistics is that the funny part about statistics is that they're not good at predicting individual events. Yeah. So what it means is like, oh, well, I'm going to, the rate, so like, let's say you pull for your waifu in Genshin Impact, and you have a 1% chance of getting her, but you feel like, well, I didn't get her, which means that it's more likely to happen in the future. I didn't get her this time, so surely the next time I'm going to get her, when in reality, that's not how it works. That one, yeah, it's basically the same idea. We infer these kinds of patterns. So basically, it's kind of the opposite, where you're inferring a negative correlation. Like, the more times I roll and don't get the character, the more likely it is that I'm going to get them on the next roll, right? Brains are dumb. Although I wish that was true because I haven't rolled ball yet, and I want that character something awful. All right. But some other fun, oh yeah, stupid brains. That's pretty much that should be the subline. Teaches Dr. Hirsch, our brains are stupid. I got a degree in psychology and just walked away thinking brains are dumb. So let's have some fun correlations here. Scatterplots, and so on the y-axis here, the vertical axis, we're looking at your score on a psychology exam. Again, there are no exams in this class, I guess, unless you really want them. And on the x-axis, we have your number of beers, your shoe size, and your percentage of classes attended. Oh, I could absolutely do a whole lecture on why gotcha is bad. Yeah, I know some people that do work professionally as I guess gotcha doctors. I don't know what you would call them, where it's sort of applied social psychology to figure out how to make people want to roll more and more and more. That might be a fun bonus lecture. So in each of these cases, we can see that there is a, do I have capture cursor on? I don't. We have a negative correlation between number of beers that you drank the night before the exam and your score on the exam. We have a zero correlation between shoe size and exam score. That one would probably be slightly positive, honestly. Because you would imagine that if someone has like a shoe size of 1 or 2, they're probably a child and probably not taking my class. So if you just handed them the exam, they probably wouldn't do great. And percentage of classes attended, I don't think that it's fun to say that's positive, but I think that's wishful thinking on the behalf of professors everywhere. I don't think that class attendance is all that correlated with class performance. That's why I never required attendance. But why not? Let's just use them for examples. They're examples that make professors feel better. That your students are not drinking and they're showing up to class, and that's why they're doing well, and not that your class is easy. All right, so moving on. Correlation versus causation. I've alluded to this a couple of times, but let's really get into the nitty-gritty. Just because two things are related does not mean that one is causing the other, because there are always other possible explanations. A could cause B, B could be actually causing A, and C could be causing both A and B. Excuse me, I'm drinking my seltzer water, so I got the burpees. Let's take the classic one here, right? So one example is ice cream and sales and violent crime. So there is a real correlation between ice cream sales and violent crime. But because we haven't been able to manipulate one of these to establish a causal pathway, for all we know, if we observe that relationship, ice cream could be causing a rise in violent crime. Violent crime could be causing ice cream sales to increase, or more likely there could be a third variable. In this case, it's rising temperatures over the summer that causes both. Yeah, it's the classic example. So correlational designs, are they externally valid? It depends. Are they internally valid? No. But they are good at studying things that we cannot manipulate. So for example, stuff like the correlation between shoe size and exam score, or health outcomes from smoking. You can't ethically assign people to be a smoker or non-smoker, but you can correlationally look at whether or not people are smokers and whether or not they have, for example, a increased rate of lung disease. So in cases where we either cannot or it is not ethical to manipulate these various factors, correlational designs are an important way of getting information. But after looking at all three of these, we still cannot infer internal validity. So where do we get that from? We get that by manipulating one of the variables and measuring how it affects the other. So we might not be able to manipulate ice cream sales, but in a laboratory environment, we can manipulate the amount of ice cream that a person consumes and then measure regression. And in doing so, because we're manipulating one variable A, in this case the ice cream consumption, and we're measuring its influence on another variable, we can't make the argument about reverse causation because we are changing one deliberately. In this case, we would call this a independent or a dependent variable. This is really where we get into experimental territory, in that we have one variable we are manipulating and another that we are measuring, and in that case, we reduce the ability, actually eliminate the ability to establish the reverse causal pathway and are able to say that yes, there is causation, and finally we can say that we are actually measuring the thing that we are measuring and have established internal validity. So in the case of, again, going way back to facilitated communication, this is an example of an experiment. They can manipulate who sees what. You can show the facilitator and the child the same picture. You can show them different pictures. And then by making that manipulation, you can establish that it is what the facilitator is seeing that is causing, not just correlated with, but causing the ultimate outcome of the child typing whatever the facilitator is seeing. This rules out confounds because we're able to systematically vary the independent variable while also isolating variables of interest, especially in a laboratory where we can hold things constant. And in terms of controlling stuff like individual differences, we can use something called random assignment. So that is to say, we have an experimental group and we have a sort of a placebo group, a control group. If we randomly assign people, as long as you have a sufficiently large sample size, those differences, like things like height, weight, gender, political orientation, all kinds of things, are going to just even out over time. And in doing so, a lot of these potential confounds, like even time of day, are people taking it in the morning, like doing the study in the morning relative to the afternoon, are going to even out. You just got to make sure you have enough people, which is one of the problems with a lot of experimental designs, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes here. But it turns out running participants is labor intensive and it is expensive, and a lot of people don't do as much of it as they should. Yep, getting a lot of people is hard. So what is the characteristic of an experiment, the fourth type of design? You manipulate the independent variable, you see how it affects the dependent variable. Typically, this is also going to consist of random assignment to groups and at least an attempt to control all other factors. Does it have external validity? It depends. You got some examples, yeah, potentially, but the nature of having this kind of controlled experiment in this controlled environment means that you're not really going to be getting that totally great and wonderful external validity that you might get with something like naturalistic observation, because, well, let's think about it for a second. You're taking people into this highly controlled and non-natural environment and asking them to do things that they might not necessarily do. When we come to the measurement of aggression, one of the very popular experiment ways of doing this now is was actually pioneered by one of my statistics mentors, the hot sauce paradigm. So you want to measure aggression. One way of doing that is to ask people to dole out hot sauce to another participant, and you're told that that other participant does not like hot sauce. So for one way of doing this is that, let's see, you have the participants come into the experiment, you ask them to write an essay. They write an essay, and then you give them, based on experimental assignment, two different forms of feedback. Either they get very positive feedback, or they get very negative and very critical feedback. And then you give them the dependent variable here as aggression. But you operationalize or define aggression by saying, all right, well, you got your feedback back from that rater. We are going to now move to the second part of the experiment. We want you to season the food that they are eating. So we are going to give them, let's say, like a sandwich. And you have the opportunity to season that sandwich however you would like. And then what the real thing they're interested in is how much hot sauce do you put on it after you're particularly told this person does not like hot sauce. So presumably, if someone is trying to show aggression to the person who gave them the feedback, they would put more hot sauce on the thing. It's a way of trying to develop, to manipulate things, but it's such a contrived situation, it really doesn't have any external validity. But it does have high internal validity if the experiment is designed well. So in this case, we might have two experimental conditions, one where you get critical feedback and one where you get good feedback. But you can have any number of conditions, right? You could have disinterested bad feedback. You could have very particularly specifically aggressive bad feedback. You could have zero feedback where they just do the essay and get nothing. And they could have a good feedback condition. Now you have 4 experimental cells. There's all kinds of ways that you can build up on and control the the different levels of the variable that you are interested in. But there are some potential hazards. And we talked about these a little bit before with the observation rooms and all that. So one of them is imitation. So let's say, for example, you're doing a drug trial and the person figures out that they are in the control group. Well, they might try, and let's say the medical trial is a meditation exercise. So in the experimental condition, they are given instructions to do a mindfulness meditation 3 times a day. And in the control group, they're told to just keep a diary. They're not told anything else. In the experimental condition, they're doing the same thing. So it's a daily diary study. Well, let's say, for example, you have 2 people that are enrolled in the study. One is in the control group and one is in the experimental group, and they talk about it. And so the person in the control group says, the doctor never told me to do those mindfulness meditations. And then they start doing them. We call this imitation, where someone in the control group figures out what the treatment is and starts to imitate it, creating problems because now you're no longer in control of what the manipulated variable is. There's also resentment, where they might figure out what instead of imitating after realizing that they are in the control group, they might say, fuck you to the experimenter, fuck you for wasting my time and putting me in the control group. And then that inference can again create a hazard where they might just start fucking with their data because they're trying to screw with your research. There's also the classics of the placebo effect. So again, let's keep the same paradigm. One group is told to do a mindfulness meditation 3 times a day. One group is told to not do anything. Both groups are told to keep a daily diary of their moods throughout the day. Now, in some cases, let's say the people in the control group might just kind of realize that they're part of a research study anyway, and the mere expectancy that they are going to feel better might cause them to feel better. And in fact, in some cases, the placebo effect is so powerful that it can actually mirror or exceed the effect of prescription drugs. It blows my mind. When I first heard about this, I was like, there's no way that's actually happening. Turns out it is, and turns out it's actually very common as a threat to experimental designs, because you'll do these clinical trials where you give people sugar pills, but they think that they're getting the medication, and it just causes a similar effect. In some cases, it might be better than the actual drug. If you give someone a sugar pill and tell them that it's Tylenol, it can have the same effect at reducing a headache or relieving pain, maybe even a stronger effect. So one way we address this is blind studies, where we don't tell people what condition they're in. Because, this is another fun one here, but we call it the nocebo effect, which is the opposite, where people, the expectancy causes, where their expectations might cause them to actually do worse. So if a person is put in a clinical trial and they expect that this is going to cause some harm, even if there are no side effects, their body might actually produce psychosomatic side effects just because they expected there to be some. Which is it's hard for me not to teach this and not relate it to vaccine hesitancy, but you might have cases where people get a vaccine, let's say a vaccination, let's say hypothetically for COVID-19, and the expectation that they will have negative side effects might cause their body to manifest those side effects, even if they aren't actually being caused by the vaccine. Brains are so stupid. It's ridiculous. So, let's see. Lost track of myself there thinking about vaccine hesitancy and getting angry. All right, back on track. Let me fix myself in my chair. Okay, there we go. What are some other threats to experimental design? Well, we talked how even very intelligent people can make mistakes. Even a researcher's expectations can influence participants because participants are able to pick up and know that, let's say, for example, even unbeknownst to the researcher, they might actually be in a situation where they are treating their patients differently depending on whether or not they are in the experimental or the control group. And that expectation might be picked up on by the participants and it might influence their behavior. So remember Clever Hans? There's also the classic example of Rosenthal's undergrads. So Rosenthal did an experiment. Gave undergrads in an intro psych course, they were trying to practice learning by teaching rats to run in a maze. Now, Rosenthal told his students, you know, some of these rats are from a pedigree of expert rat maze runners. They are extremely good at this because their parents were good at this. And some of these rats, they're going to be bad at this because their parents are bad at this. Now, there's no such thing as rat pedigrees. We're not talking about racehorses here. But there was a real difference at the end of the semester. The students that were told that their rats were smart and were going to be good at running the maze trained their rats better than the students that were told that their rats were dull or not going to be able to be good at this. Because it was their expectation of their rats that was influencing their behavior and how they treated the rat that had downstream consequences on how the rats learned to run. Uma Musume, let's see. Uma Musume, but for rat girls, isn't that part of Hololive Gen 2? So how do we fix this? Double-blind studies, where even the experimenter doesn't know what group the person is in. We talked a little bit about demand characteristics as well when we talked about observation and observation rooms. So again, participants might be able to guess your hypothesis and then fuck with you by either trying to give you data that supports or breaks your hypothesis. So in this case, let's go back to the hot sauce paradigm. They might realize, and maybe they've read a paper that says, oh yeah, this is a common experimental thing that people use to measure aggression. So they might say, well, I don't want to be aggressive. Or the experimenter is so nice and so beautiful and her antlers look great today, so I am going to give her the data that I think she wants. It's a constant problem, and it's why we have to come up with cover stories and mislead people in experiments because of this exact concern. If people know what we're trying to measure, they can make the conscious decision to either give us evidence in support or refutation of what we're doing. Hence the cover stories and sometimes filler items, where maybe in that survey you're filling out in the experiment, you've got 20 items, I may only be interested in 3 of them. The other 17 are bullshit to make you question whether or not you actually know what the study is about. So one way of getting data, let's see. Actually, before we pivot here, this is kind of a natural break. Are there any questions, comments, troubles, concerns, or death threats? Please keep the death threats to yourselves, but all the other ones are fine. No? Not a 1? Alright, that's fine. Alright. This is the part where I admit that I'm not a good streamer. What does the 07 mean? Is that like raising your hand? This is like Kusa for me, where it took me like 6 months to understand what people were saying. Ah, it's a salute. That makes sense. All right, good to go. Hell yeah. All right. So we're trying to collect data. There are a couple different ways to do this. Now we talked about the design. Let's talk about how we treat data. One way to do this is self-report. I can just ask somebody, what's your favorite color? Do you agree with the following statement? so on and so forth. And even though we use a lot of surveys and questionnaires in psychological research, there are some hazards to self-report. So for example, it is very sensitive to format. So if I ask someone a question like, it was easy for me to remember how to perform tasks using a spreadsheet, I can, depending on my response options, I can say, or how I word the question, I might get very different data, even though the underlying construct or thing I'm trying to measure doesn't actually change all that much. There's also a factor of being sensitive to wording. So for example, if I say, do you think public speeches against democracy should be allowed? That's a question. It's about approval of public speeches against democracy. But if I say, do you think public speeches against democracy should be forbidden? Same underlying question. But by framing it as, do you think it should be allowed versus do you think it should be forbidden, turns out robustly people will give different answers, even though these are ostensibly the same question. It's all a matter of framing, and framing effects are very prolific in affecting how we think about things. Why do we do this then? They're very interpretable, and things tend to be... Yeah, that's exactly it right there. But democracy is good, but forbidden is a bad word. Should not be allowed is very different than forbidden in terms of how people process it, and so you get different answers. So why do we do self-report, even though it has these problems? It turns out it's extremely easy. Most people are actually very good at telling you how they feel. So I did a lot of work on indirect measures, which we'll talk about in a second. But at the end of my tenure as a grad student, I was actually more convinced that maybe self-report was the way to go. Because at least insofar as you can ensure to people that their responses are confidential and can't be used to identify them, you would be shocked at what people will tell you on a survey. They will talk about their sexual history, they will talk about their partners, they will talk about their political orientation, they'll talk about their religion, they will tell you that they are racist, they will tell you that they are sexist, they will tell you that they are homophobic, they will tell you that they are transphobic. As long as they're not worried that that's going to come back to them. Yeah. Famous statistic here, but in terms of self-report, as long as you anonymize it, what is it? Is it, what's the percentage? Let me Google it real quick. Police officers. This is why I will never get into an agency, because I will undoubtedly Google this in front of tens of thousands of people. Police officers beat their wives. What's the statistic again? Of police officers that are willing to admit to domestic abuse. I want to say it was in the 60s. Is it 63%? I want to say it's somewhere in the 60s. Well, here we go. What percentage of cops beat their wives? Roughly 40%. So in a 2021 statistic, an FBI advisory board found that 40% of officers on a self-report questionnaire reported that they beat their wives. That's in the 2021 report. I've seen it upwards as high as 60% in some surveys. And that's what they're willing to admit. Think about that. 40% of cops are willing to just say, yes, I hit my partner on a survey. It's shocking what people are willing to self-report. Since I am totally independent and I embody the spirit of Fugazi, let me say that all cops are bastards. Not just that 40%, all of them. ACAB. All cats are beautiful. Self-report. Yeah. ACAB can be all cats are beautiful, but it's usually whenever you see ACAB or any acronym of it, it's usually really meant to infer all cops are bastards. So that's your lesson for the day. All right. Disadvantages of self-report, though. There is an issue with a lack of introspective access, and turns out that some people are not particularly great at accurately recalling information. So if you ask somebody how often do you go grocery shopping, I would personally tell you once a week. But I am not going to give you, I might in some weeks end up going to the local market because I forgot to get snacks or something like that. Or I'm out of coffee and I feel like I'm dying. in those cases, do you count that as grocery shopping? Like, does that count? Like, I technically didn't go to the market. I went to like the corner store. Like, is that the same thing? These are issues of self-report because you get into construal with the like into, or how do I interpret the question, or what do I consider to be part of the what do I personally consider to be grocery shopping, right? Also, people fucking lie. I mean, 40% of cops will admit they beat their wives, but you know what? Some percentage of that 60% are lying about it. At least that's what I'm willing to say, probably because of social desirability. So what else can we do? Well, we can look at behavior. We can use indirect measures like inferring based on reaction time, or we can ask other people so that we get around this idea of self-report. So, instead of asking how often do I go to the grocery store, you might ask my partner, how often does Ricky go to the grocery store? And in that case, you might actually get different answers, right? So how do we evaluate a measure? Well, one way to look at it is reliability. So we talked about validity before, but reliability is in sort of they're the kind of related, they're like very close cousins. So reliability, there can come in a couple of different flavors, one of which is test, retest reliability. And that is, like, say if I ask you the question, then I ask you the question again, do you say the same answer? So I might tell you, let's say I'm giving you a very anonymous survey that you don't know is coming from me, and I say, who is your favorite deer-themed VTuber? And you say, anyone but Ricky. And then I ask you again, and you say, obviously it's Ricky. That's poor test, retest reliability. Ideally, you would say me both times. So when we talk about validity, though, kind of pulling this back, remember, validity is the extent to which we can say that we are measuring what we say we are measuring. Well, it turns out that you really can't be valid unless you are reliable. But you absolutely can be reliable but not be valid. So you could say, for example, we want to measure height as a measure of intelligence. Now, if you measure me once and you measure my height, well, you're probably going to get one answer. And if you measure me again, well, then you're probably going to get a similar answer, unless I decide to embiggen myself, and then you might get a very different answer. Whoop, let's see if we can fix that. All right, I'm back to normal. And so in that case, we would say that height is a reliable measure, but we would not necessarily say, tag yourself, you're all valid and you're all reliable people. Don't you dare put yourselves out. I'm the only one that gets to not have confidence here, okay? This is my show. Take a sippy there. All right. So yeah, in that case, we would say height is a reliable measure, but it's not necessarily a valid measure of intelligence. You can also be valid. In this case, we see like you're on the board, but you're not reliable. You can be not reliable and also not valid. You can also be reliable and valid. But the important part is to say that you can be reliable but not valid, but you cannot be valid but not reliable. Does that make sense? I hope so. Okay, so we're going to be pivoting. This would be, when I was teaching, this would be the day 2 part of the lecture. So it's going to be a good chunk here. So I'm going to do actually a lot of editorializing in this section because I wrote in a couple of slides about reproducibility, which is something that's very important and very near and very, very dear to my heart. Get it? Because I am a deer. I'm so funny. Any questions or anything before we pivot to, I guess, like the second topic of today? Ah, is there a question? A question! What is your question, Reina? Oh, it's from a second ago. There was no question. I was fooled. I am a fool. All right. Talking about statistics then. All right. So why do we do statistics? Well, one is, well, two broad categories, either descriptive or inferential. Either we are trying to draw conclusions from a result, or which we would call inferential, or we are trying to communicate patterns of results, in which we would call descriptive statistics. So descriptive data can be something like numerical summaries of data, like all of those really wonderful and helpful reports that Twitch sends me after I stream that tell me that I didn't do as good as the last time I streamed and that I shouldn't be doing these. You should play more Guilty Gear and do less lecturing, according to Twitch. That's their so the descriptive, like, this is a good example actually. The descriptive example is just the raw data. The inference is them trying to tell me that I should be doing different things and not this. I say nay, though. This is more fun. So in the case of descriptive statistics, you might get measures of central tendency, like the mean, which is your average across all scores. So you might get something like, what is the average viewership or your average number of viewers? You might get something, but in some cases, if you have very skewed data, it might be more appropriate to look at the median, or which is if you do a lay out all of your numbers in a set, let's say across all your streams, and you say that, you had, you had 100 viewers one night and 10 viewers another night and 15 and then 60, 70, 90, 5,000 and so on and so forth. And it's all laid out in a row. You just pick the middle one in that set, and that's the median. The mode is the most frequently occurring score in a data set. So right now, if you were to look at all of the score, like all the viewer counts on Twitch right now, I'd put money down on the fact on the mode or the modal answer being either 1 or 0 for the number of viewers across the platform. So when we talk about central tendency, it's one thing to say where is the middle point. It's another thing to say how tightly or loosely bunched are the scores in the data set. So for example, we can look at that something like the standard deviation, which is how far does each data point tend to fall from the mean. So when we say a standard deviation, we'll talk about later, but generally it's like 99.5, 99.7% of scores fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean. And so having a very high standard deviation gives us the impression that the scores are actually pretty well split around. A range is going to give us a measure of the difference between the highest and the lowest scores on the data set. Now, inferential statistics, now remember in this case, the example I'm going to go for here is that we've got a set of descriptive statistics that are just the numbers. In this case, let's say it's the numbers that Twitch is sending me after I stream. If we go to the inferential statistics, let's say, how do I use those to try to infer conclusions about the real world? So I might take that data and I might look at the accumulation of all my streams and look at the kind of games that I play. And I might make the inference that there is using a significance test, there is a significant relationship or correlation between maybe the day of the week that I'm streaming and my viewership. So I might say Tuesdays seem better. Maybe it's because somebody else isn't streaming around that time or whatever. The people that tend to watch me are off work or something like that. And then in that case, I might say, all right, well, I should probably stream more on Tuesdays because it seems like there is a relationship between the day of the week and my viewership. So how do you decide when a p-value is significant? We're going to talk about that. So basically, the way that people tend to make these inferences is what we call p-values. Now, the funny thing is that no one really knows what a p-value is, but everyone uses them. I personally don't like them a lot, but I'm going to grind my axe a little bit. So, well, I guess, pardon me while I grind my axe a little bit. There's going to be some sparks here. So in general, what a lot of people are taught in their Psych 101 course is that p-values are the red light, green light of publication. So you do your significance test and it says there is a p-value. Usually convention is to say that it is greater than or less than 0.05. Now, when you say a p-value is less than 0.05, that usually is taken by some researchers as the mark for significance. If the relationship has a p-value of less than 0.05, then we say that it is significant, and there is more value evidence against the null to say that there is a relationship between these two variables and it's not just noise. Now, there is an enormous problem with p-values, a unbelievably huge problem that people don't think about, because it turns out that a lot of researchers, in trying to get their work published and advance their careers, started taking p-values as more than they actually are and saying, as long as we can get this value under 0.05, this research is valuable and it's significant and has a significant knowledge value. And that is not true. Sorry, I'm losing my composure here because I get so mad about p-values. So what is the problem? P-values are heavily skewed by sample size. Enormously skewed by sample size, because they are in large part a function of confidence intervals. So in this case, now in each of these points, this might take a second to orient to. A confidence interval is a measure of variability. So when we say that we have let's say a 95% confidence interval, we are saying that 95% of the scores fall within this range of values. Now, in this case, each of these points have the same mean. They have the same exact mean, but, oh, it does look like my hat, doesn't it? The exact same mean, but as sample size increases, necessarily, the confidence interval decreases. So if you're looking at the proportion of variability and overlap between two values, as you increase your sample size, the p-value is necessarily going to get lower. So in my grad school work, sometimes I would work with data sets that included millions of people, like census level data sets. And you could take something like random participant number, randomized participant ID number, just like 110112458. And that would be significantly correlated with something like happiness. Or let's say we had the PNAS, or even the TIPI, the 10-item personality inventory. You could find a significant relationship between randomly assigned participant ID number and extroversion as a personality trait, because there were so many people that these nonsense correlations became significant. And this is a huge problem, because in an effort to get work published, researchers started only caring about p-values, which means that there is an enormous amount of research out there that was published based on nonsense correlations, because the heuristic became, if the p-value is less than 0.05, p means publishable. And writers started doing it, editors started using it, and all of a sudden we have an enormous body of scientific work that is bullshit, because people didn't actually read their statistical manuals and didn't know what p-values represented. It makes me mad. It makes me really mad that there's 20 years of research in my field that I do not trust. So p less than 0.05 is the common convention that is still used occasionally. Basically, the idea is that if p is less than 0.05, you reject the null hypothesis, because that data is then effectively taken as a heuristic to say that there is an effect, and that the relationship we're observing between the variables is not just based on noise. But there is a difference between statistical significance and practical significance, and practical significance took a backseat in scientific publishing for a very long time. So the practical significance is the real world importance of the finding. And so if there is a p-value of less than 0.05, that says nothing about the size of the effect. Nor does it say that you should necessarily care, nor does it say that the effect is real. It just says that there is a particular amount of noise to signal ratio. So what is an effect size? Now, thankfully, this is where I get a little bit happier. There's been, and we'll talk about it, a little bit of a, let's call it a reckoning, because I think that's actually the appropriate term to use, in how scientific publishing is handled. And so now there is a greater degree of emphasis on, there we go. My shock mount was crooked. There is a greater degree of emphasis on effect sizes, so much so that actually in the time that I was publishing in grad school, if you tried to publish a paper using only p-values as your evidence, as evidentiary value, usually that paper would get rejected. And it's because you need to also include a effect size that actually speaks to the size or effect of the relationship that is not as skewed by sample size. So for example, Cohen's d is a popular measure where it goes from, I want to say 0 to 0.1 is Cohen's d, -1 to 0.1. I might be wrong about that one off the top of my head. But it says, like, the guidance says that, like, if you have a Cohen's d of like either less than -0.2 or greater than +0.2 or absolute value of 0.2, that's considered to be a relatively strong effect and something that maybe people should care about. And this is irrespective of p-values, and so it's something like it's a complementary evidentiary value that helps people to interpret whether or not the effect is something they should care about. Now, this is where I teach you about something secret that people don't want you to know. Everything that most people are taught in their undergraduate statistic courses falls under the umbrella of what we call probabilistic statistics. And there are a whole world of evidentiary statistics outside of that, one of which is Bayesian statistics, which is based on matrix algebra. This is where I show off how big my brain is under this hat. Bayesian statistics are an alternative that for a long time were computationally prohibitive for research because it took so fucking long to compute these matrices. So back in the age of punch cards and big machines where people would, fill out a bunch of surveys on punch cards, take them to the entire room on campus that was taken up by the supercomputer to get their results, and then they'd come back 2 days later, you really couldn't do Bayesian work. But now you can. And it seems like maybe this is catching on in the world of research. So, as an alternative to classic hypothesis testing, Bayesian statistics differ in a very important way. So, what they require is the likelihood of one hypothesis relative to another. We call these priors. So, when I want to do a Bayesian analysis, I have to specify what I think the relationship between these variables should be, and then it gives me a figure that I interpret as the relative degree of evidence for one hypothesis relative to another. So I have my prior, which means that before I can even run that analysis, I have to have thought about what I think that result might be. This is an enormous change of pace from plain Jane probabilistic statistics, because all of a sudden you have to start thinking about your analyses ahead of time, and which cuts down enormously on the amount of bullshit that people can do to fudge their numbers. You can't just keep bashing numbers together till you find something significant. You have to think about and write down what you are going to do beforehand with Bayesian statistics, which means that you do better science and ultimately produce better, more valuable research. But that's just my opinion. I'm a Bayesian statistician person. I'm a Beyblade statistician. If you can't tell, I'm very passionate about this stuff. I've actually authored a couple of papers using Bayesian statistics, and I think they're the best work I ever did. There was a very satisfied feeling of putting out a paper that was working something. Let's see, the question is, does it make it easier to get confirmation bias in some cases? It depends. So if you do, I'll talk about pre-registration in a second, but not necessarily. So confirmation bias is always a problem, but it's typically taken care of through good experimental design. But in the case of Bayesian statistics, so let's just put it this way. The way things were, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the reproducibility crisis, is that people would just keep running experiments until they got the result they wanted. And then that would be taken as, well, that was the one that worked, that was correct, and that's taken as a evidence of confirmation bias. And it fucking sucks. So, because it ends up producing a bunch of bonk science. Bayesian statistics are not necessarily more prone to confirmation bias than probabilistic statistics. What they do require is that you do have to put some thought into it and say, and usually it's based on the literature. So we might say that based on this meta-analysis, which is a study of studies, the relationship between these two variables should be this. And then you do your own experiment and you say the relationship should be this, and then it will tell you, well, in the data that you collected, there is the hypothesis that you maybe specified, and then there's the null where there is no evidence whatsoever. And it will say that, well, there is proportionally more or less evidence for the experimental hypothesis that you was informed by existing literature that you specified ahead of time, or the null that there is ultimately no effect. Does that make sense? Basically, it's that if you're just kind of shooting in the dark, it's still a little bit better, because a lot of times people are just kind of bashing numbers together and then making up an ad hoc explanation for it. But ideally, in the world of Bayesian statistics and pre-registration, you're basing those expectations and hypotheses based on it. Yeah, so, and it's also, let me actually, all right, I'm gonna deviate from my slides a bit because maybe this will actually help. Bayesian statistics are complicated. Bayesian statistics, Bayesian inference. Let's see if I can find where is that super special chart that I wrote in that paper? Maybe I can find it. Maybe I can find it if I go to the Google. That is not how Bayes factors work. That is not. Okay, this is actually really good. Okay, this might be helpful. So let's say I am trying to, I'm going to call this Bayes. I am a researcher, and I am trying to use evidence to determine what my hypothesis should be. And so I go to the research and I say, well, I've got an alternative hypothesis that I've informed by prior research that is saying that there should be a relationship between these variables, or this experiment that I did this manipulation, the effect size should be approximately X. And then you also specify your null and say that there is no relationship. And then you get a Bayes factor that is somewhere between 0 and 100. And so rather than getting just a raw significance test, what it says is that, let's say within this first bracket, the 0.3 to 3, you have weak evidence skewing in one direction. The 0.1 and then the 0.1 to 10, you've got moderate and then strong and then very strong evidence in one direction or the other. So it's telling you not that, hey, a p-value is non-directional. It just tells you that there is something going on in this data set. A Bayes factor requires that you have to have a hypothesis going in and gives you a proportional amount of evidence in favor of one way or the other. So it's kind of a mix of a significance test, and it can also be a very good measure of effect size. I love them, if you can't tell. Let's see, this slide we already went over, so there's no real reason to go over it. I'm going to skip this one. I should have deleted it earlier. All right, here's a good one. So we talked about mean, median, and mode, right? Yeah, Bayes, you typically will never hear the term Bayesian or Bayes factors or anything in an undergrad course. So this is consider yourself on the advanced course now. You now know something and probably understand Bayes factors better than most of the doctors that I know. Aren't you special? So what are we going to talk about here? So in this case, we're looking at heavily skewed data. This is distributions of CEO compensation, but you could also take this as, if you want to look at other very skewed data, you could look at average number of viewers on Twitch. So in this case, what you might say is, do you want to use a mean, a median, or a mode? Well, if you use the mean, what you might find out is that this data is heavily skewed by the people on the top end in like a very small number of people. Whereas you use the median, you might get a number that's makes a little bit more sense, right? And so there's different reasons that you use different information. And when we're looking at skew, this is kind of, again, sort of a visual representation. I alluded to before about the normal distribution. In normally distributed data, generally a standard deviation, we would say that like 68% of the data falls within one standard deviation, 95 within two, 99.7. I was right, 99.7. Fuck yes. I used to get that wrong all the time in grad school. Falls within 3 standard deviations of the mean. So typically, like, we want to care about, the reason we want to care about normally distributed data that tends to follow these rules, and we are worried about skewed data, is because, well, turns out that a lot of the tests that we use, like linear regression and all that, have assumptions about the underlying distribution of the data. So if you're looking at something like CEO income and you want to do a plain Jane linear regression, it might not necessarily be advisable because you have heavily skewed data, which means that certain tests are not going to work under these environments, and you might have to fudge or transform the data in some way to make it work. So let's evaluate research. Turns out, intentionally or unintentionally, statistics can be very misleading. Lies, damn lies, statistics, and statistics that are being taught to you by VTubers. If you start to see that people are using skewed data or data that you know to be skewed, like income, another big one, again, like is Twitch viewership, and they are using means, there might be a particular narrative they're trying to push because the median would actually be the more appropriate measure. You might also see certain cases where base rates are neglected or someone truncates the graph. So let's say, for example, the x-axis ranges from 0 to 10, but the only real action that is happening is between the values of 8 and 10. So they truncate it to only show that very extreme part of the data to try to show that there's a much more intense or linear relationship than there really is. People lie all the damn time to try to get their papers published. Oop. And also, papers can be lucky. So remember when I said that, the p-value is 0.05, which is like, we say that there is a less than 5% chance that this occurred purely by chance, right? That this is purely accidental or a result. The relationship between these two variables is the result of just dumb luck. Well, what happens if you run that study 20 times and just publish the one that works? We call this p-hacking. In the wild, wild world of statistics and of research, this is incredibly common, actually. People do all kinds of shit to fudge numbers to get their relationship that they're trying to publish under that 0.05 threshold. It's become an enormous problem in research because turns out that if you are a particularly motivated researcher, there is all kinds of crap that you can do to your data to massage or coerce or torture your data to get these relationships to look the way that you want in a way that is going to produce more papers. And it sucks because it causes all kinds of problems all across the board. So we think that, peer review is ideally going to catch a lot of these things, but what happens when it becomes so commonplace that everyone is doing it? Or even worse, everyone was trained that these are the normal techniques that you're supposed to use. And yet someone might report in their paper, hey, we measured and, we threw out a lot of participants, for some bullshit reason after the fact. Or anybody that, the scale was from 1 to 10, but the people that gave a response between 1 and 3, we found an ad hoc reason to disqualify them from the study and threw them out. Well, turns out that might be what they did to make that p-value work. It was very, very common for a very long time in psychology. But recently, there's been a push for more transparency, and particularly open data, open materials, and reproducibility. So the good scientist that I am, every paper that I have ever published, the data is available for free on the internet, but I'm not going to tell you my real name to look for them. That's basically it. You disprove my point, but get out of here. You don't count. Or, in confirmation bias and ad hoc reasoning, it's very impressive what a lot of researchers, even very intelligent people, have been able to convince themselves of as a justification to exclude people from a study. So why does a lot of this matter in this push for transparency? Because, peer review, like I said, is a fallible process. But if you put your data and your materials up on the internet, I might say, hey, you ran this data, and if you exclude these people, your model works. But if you don't exclude them, it doesn't. I, as a reviewer, might see that paper, run their analyses in a different way, and realize that it doesn't work. Replicability or reproducibility has also been a very big thing now. So remember, it's like if you have to run that study 20 times to get the one time that it worked, do it again. If you aren't getting those results consistently, then it probably isn't a real effect. And so there's been a push among journals to also require replications. So you run your data, you get your effect. If you can't reproduce it, most journals would, at least for a stretch there, would not look at you. Or it would help your paper a lot if you could say that, hey, we ran this, we got these results, and then we were able to run it and get it again. So like I was saying, like I believe very strongly in this stuff. It's very central to my identity as a researcher in thinking about transparency and open data. I mean, in my mind, there are people that are tenured and spooky, and they are afraid of this because they p-hacked their way to tenure, and they're afraid that maybe this will throw some shade on their legacy. In my perspective, this has only been good, and this has only made me a better researcher. So for example, maybe I make a model, I have my statistical model, I submit the paper, and one of my reviewers says, this is good, but, I ran your data this way or did a different technique because you provided that data to me, and I actually found stronger evidence than what you're presenting here. As a researcher, some people are intimidated by that, and it sucks. For me, I'm like, wow, shit, thank you for showing me that maybe I could look at my data a different way. Kind of cool, right? So let's talk about what you all can do and what's the takeaway here. Let's talk about evaluating psychology in the media. Yeah, I agree that I very much agree that free and open knowledge is important. It's a big reason why I'm doing this whole series here. And yeah, so instead of doing something 20 times, you do it 40 times. Now, presumably, if you do something 40 times and only works twice, eventually even the thickest of professors will figure it out and realize that they're trying to publish bullshit. Or at least becomes easier. We call it the file drawer effect, actually, which is when you just don't talk about the studies that don't work. We consider that, we call it being file drawered. All right. So what's the problem with a lot of psychology, especially pop psych in the media? A lot of times, the interests of capitalism and capitalist-driven media are not aligned with truth-telling. People may exaggerate claims, they may focus on non-central messages, and they may misunderstand the study in the first place. So consider the source of the media when you're evaluating research. This is one of my favorite examples. I want to say from Cosmo back in 2013. There was a paper published that showed that in partner studies where the one partner was successful at a task and the other was manipulated to get very bad feedback on the same task, a researcher found that men, but not women, experienced a dip in their self-esteem when their partner was successful and they weren't. Well, this was picked up and this was written up in a lot of different magazines. In this case, this is from Cosmo, that tried to make it into more than it was, which is to say that these men are resenting the successful women in their lives, which is not what that study was saying at all. I've actually spoken with the author of this paper, particularly about this headline, and she thought it was really funny that this is what the person went away with, but also, come on. Like, this isn't what her paper was about at all. All right. More fun stuff. Ethical issues in human research. You might be familiar with the Tuskegee study, which ran from 1932 to 1972. It was a study of syphilis by the US government. 399 men, black men in particular, this is a extreme case of racial injustice in scientific medical research, were diagnosed with syphilis and then were never told they had syphilis because the doctors wanted to observe what would happen in the progression of the disease. And so even at the point where there were antibiotics and medical treatments for syphilis, they were lied to and denied those treatments to see what would happen over time. 128 of them died of the disease, 48 unknowingly infected their wives, 19 children were born with syphilis, and it took until 1997 for the government to apologize. In other cases, less extreme, we have the Stanley Milgram study, so you might be familiar with Milgram. You probably are, at least through parody. So Milgram decided to do a little bit of research, you know, and Milgram thought it would be funny to, well, not really funny, but to lead people to believe that, let's see, that they had killed another person. That's the long and short of it. It's a classic study on obedience. You might have seen the image of the researcher in the lab coat saying, well, the experiment must continue. People were brought into the lab and they were told that this was an experiment on learning. They were given a switchboard and they were told that every time the person screws up and doesn't remember the word pairing, you are going to progressively flip a more intense electrical shock. And there was a big banner on the switchboard that eventually said like danger, hazard, lethal shock. And they would keep flip, and what Milgram found was that people would tend to keep flipping the switch even when they were told that this might kill the person in the other room, even when they were told and they were piping recordings into their room that this person was screaming and asking to be released and told that they had and saying they had a heart condition and that they might die. Usually after they played the I have a heart condition, I'm in pain, please stop shocking me, the experimenter would say the experiment must continue, and then the participant, air quotes, other participant, the receiver of the shocks, the learner in the experiment, would stop responding and presumably had died. Not a very ethical experiment. Many people were very traumatized by Milgram's experiments because they were led to believe they had murdered someone. And then typically, in some cases, were not fully debriefed and walked out of that experiment fully believing they had murdered someone today. Cool, right? The 1960s were a great time for experimental research. You might also be familiar with the Stanford prison experiment. We'll get to this in social psych, where wonderful, I guess I can say it, probably sexual predator Philip Zimbardo, shitty researcher and full of shit and sexual predator Philip Zimbardo, ran the Stanford prison experiment where he randomly assigned some students to be prisoners and some students to be guards, and the guards became sadistic and abusive, and, you know, we'll talk about it later. You've probably heard about it. It's like the experiment had to be canceled after a couple of days, and then basically he ran a unsupervised and unethical study, and then milked it for his entire career, and basically hasn't done anything since. Basically a fraud, in my opinion. I think Philip Zimbardo has done a tremendous degree of harm to the field of social psychology, but I'm just a virtual YouTuber. Many of those boys were horribly traumatized by the Stanford prison experiment, and so thankfully we have IRBs now that keep people from being able to do stuff. Now, there were some modifications actually made to Milgram's paradigm, and it actually did recently replicate, so we can have some level of confidence in that study. So the ethical issues in human research, like I said, we now have IRBs, or major institutional review boards, that are going to tell you whether or not you are hurting people. They tend to look at importance of informed consent, where we actually have to weigh the risks and beliefs. We have to give people unless you cannot do the experiment without people knowing, you generally have to tell people what is going on. Yep, recently, as in the last couple of years when I was teaching, but yeah, Milgram, with modifications to make it work via an IRB, the core finding of the power of authority and obedience has replicated. So uses of deception are obviously a problem, right? You know, how can we ethically hide what we're doing from people? Well, this is where we get into risk and benefit analysis. When you are proposing your research to the IRB, you have to tell them, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to lie to people, but I cannot do this research unless I do it. And then afterwards, I'm going to debrief them. I'm going to tell the person, hey, this is what I did, and this is why I did it. And this is what we hope to learn. The importance of a debriefing. We also, IRBs are very concerned with privacy. We have to make sure that we are de-identifying data, and we are not telling people, if we're doing let's say a study on racial bias, we're not going to publish people's first names and say that this person is a racist. There are some issues as well with ethical issues in animal research. So about 7 to 8% of research uses rodents or birds. IRBs will also weigh in on these and help us. These can help us generate ideas about brain and behavior without necessarily having to harm people. And that's what I've got actually for chapter 2. Next time I do this, I don't know if I'll be around next weekend for this, but next weekend or the next class session will be on the physical anatomy of the brain. We're going to talk about the breakdowns of the brain. We're going to talk about Phineas gauge. We're going to talk about a lot of the physicality of why your brains are dumb and also how neurons work. So that's what I've got, but I have a special treat for you all because in terms of I talked a little bit there about reproducibility failures, right? Well, let's really get into this one. Let's see. Hide the display capture. Where is my window? There it is. So I came across a paper this week. I checked Facebook, unfortunately. So let's talk about the death of behavioral economics. So you might have heard the term behavioral economics. People use it all the time, right? It's like it's basically applied social psychology. But there's some bad news. The field is dead. I regret to inform you, behavioral economics is not a thing. And a lot of the core tenets that we consider to be part of behavioral economics have failed to systemically replicate, in part because a lot of the interventions that were published and taken as like very cool and novel and intuitive, turns out that these were probably biased by p-hacking, and that a lot of large-scale replication efforts that have looked at the effect of behavioral economic interventions have failed to show either effects at all or have showed that the effects are dramatically weaker than people believe. But now this is an important thing I want to talk about. It's a fake! I love you, Julie. Sorry, special guest appearance. Zombie theories. So here's the problem that we're right now dealing with in psychological research and just the general field of science in general. Turns out p-hacking was super common across the board. It was encouraged and people were trained to do it for a very long time, which means that we now have a lot of papers that have been published. But the incentive structure of publication devalues replications and devalues null results, which means that the original paper might exist in publication and be cited and influence research long after it has been discredited, because the system of scientific publishing is not going to report the death of a theory. Hence, it is sort of passed around conferences and VTuber lectures and stuff that, like, for example, in this paper in particular, they're talking about loss aversion. Turns out priming, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which is used in, like, if you might have heard about Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a very popular pop psych book. The core tenet, priming, does not replicate. The identifiable victim effect with Berman and Ehrlich does not necessarily replicate. There are a lot of even stuff like loss aversion, which is considered to be maybe the most seminal finding in the field of behavioral economics. Let me try to put this in context. For loss aversion to not replicate, it's like if a physicist were to let go of an object and it floated in the air. It's like if you threw something up in the air and it didn't come down. It jeopardizes the entire area of knowledge that has been built upon it. And when you think about that, it is devastating if you think that behavioral economics are a real thing. That's not to say that some of these don't work, or that they're like some of the findings in the whole field are bonk, but there is an enormous problem where there are systemic issues in publishing that have produced a body of what we consider to be foundational work in these fields that is the result of errant statistics and in some cases research malfeasance. And it makes it very scary out there. Because if you're a poor grad student and you're trying to build your portfolio before you go on the job market, maybe you're interested in priming, maybe you're interested in power posing, and you do all these studies and they keep fucking failing. You're wasting, and all the while, maybe the person who published them kind of knows that this is bonk and they just publish them to further their own careers. Where does that leave the people who didn't have that knowledge? Because the knowledge of those no results those failed studies tend to just end up in people's file drawers, which produces a zombie theory. People generally believe that power posing is real. Power posing is bullshit. I'm sorry. I'm gonna break some bad news to you this time too. Power posing isn't real. The effect is considered to be a meta-analytic null. It doesn't do anything. Doing the Wonder Woman pose in a... Okay, power posing. All right, this is why it's good that I have the Google, right? Power posing! Oh, this is a great picture. This is a great picture. All right. You might have seen her very famous TED Talk. This is Amy Cuddy. Amy Cuddy, who wrote this, so back in grad school, this is where I'm going to throw some shade, okay? I was at a conference where she did a very famous TED Talk about the importance of power posing. It's rooted in the idea of what we call embodied cognition, and that is that people can strike, particular poses, and that can influence the way your body is laid out, can change the way that you think about yourself, the way your confidence and your emotional state. It's kind of like saying strike the Wonder Woman pose and you might feel more confident or more powerful. Does not work. Meta-analytic null, it is not a real effect. Amy Cuddy kept swearing and refusing to acknowledge that this was the incredible mountain of evidence against this effect, all the while she was writing this to TED Talks, she was writing books and making money hand over fist on promoting it. In fact, what's really great about it is that she isn't even the first author on the original power posing paper. She was just one of 3, of which the other 2 authors recanted the paper long before she did. But she rode the zombie theory to fame and fortune. And now a lot of people think that power posing is real. You get shit like this. I mean, this is up on an actual, training and life coaching thing. Strike the Wonder Woman pose and you'll feel more powerful. Empower your body language. It's gonna help you. It's gonna be great. Just gonna put out here 8 power poses, body language, and confidence. This was published this was put up on YouTube in 2019. Sorry, this is let me shift the window around. This is where I knock other YouTubers. 2 million views on this, right? Long ago, we knew this was not real as researchers. But because the meta-analytic, the research that would disprove this is not as eye-catching, this is a zombie theory that is now floating around in the public consciousness, that changing your body language is going to have this is massive. It's one of the most popular TED Talks of all time. It's also one of the things, if you can't tell, I get the angriest about. So 2 million people have viewed this thing in the last 2 years that says that changing your body language can improve your confidence. And that is not true. It is a fucking lie. And this person has 1.6 million subscribers. I should have those subscribers. It makes me so angry. It makes me so angry. Look, 2 million people have watched this, and this is bonk. This person is not a scientist. They don't know the science. If they did, or if they do, they are doing malfeasance here and lying to people. They are lying to people and telling them about this bullshit placebo that they should know is not real. And yet, And yet this zombie theory continues to exist, and it's only one of many. The field of social psych and behavioral economics and applied social psych, whatever you want to talk about, is full of this crap. And it's so frustrating. All right, that's probably a good spot for me to end for the week. But, man. Yeah. Some examples of how power posing can actually boost your confidence. This was back in 2012. But I was actually at a conference where Amy Cuddy had to give an apology tour about how she would have been bullied for being a bad researcher. I'm sorry, but when your co-authors are telling you that like, you weren't even the first author on that paper, and you wrote it to a TED Talk, and you wrote it to being one of the most one of the most powerful and influential pop psychologists in the world, and you got tenured at Harvard, and you made boatloads of money doing expensive TED Talks and power posing symposiums and shit, you don't get to do a pity tour. You did bad science and own it. Okay, finally I said it out loud to my however many of tens of people that might watch this. Makes me so mad. I think in this case, so looking at chat here, editorializing, I think she had to have known that this was not a real effect, and she kept making money off of it, especially because her co-authors on the same paper. In fact, one of them had put in their professional website, "Please stop asking me about power posing. I don't think it's real." All the while she was making money doing corporate tours. The science of power posing is one of ongoing study. Fuck that. It's not real. It's about power posing is real as I am a deer. I can't even keep modulating my voice. I get so angry about this. Another bit about power posing that I'm going to throw in here is that I know I am a deer. But power posing isn't real. Power posing is also heavily marketed and couched in this like world of corporate feminist capitalism, of like girl boss CEO bullshit. So it's like it's all this wrapped up world of like corporate capitalist feminism, and it all sucks. It sucks all the way down. So this is my my cool way to get into, you know, to say the things and like all that, you know. It's fun. It's great. It's very uplifting. I'm glad I was able to uplift you all with this one. Yeah, we need more women in the boardroom. Maybe I should just like stop being an honest researcher. It would probably help my YouTube career. All right, well, I'm gonna end it here this week. And this is gonna be, I'm gonna transition to my chatting portion. So if you're watching this on YouTube, I hope you had fun. Hopefully I'll see you next time video. And in the meantime, if you ever get a chance to watch me live on Twitch, you should follow me on Twitter. You can join my Discord. You find my links everywhere. Follow me on Twitch, and you can interact in real time with me while I'm doing this and all that cool stuff. Hey, and I'll see you next time. Bye.